let me welcome everybody. I'm Vincent Medley, as many of you know, the Maddie's director for the Human Animal Support Services Project. So before we get started in the presentation tonight, which is a presentation on animal welfare legislation, I'm going to review a few housekeeping notes. So here are the notes. And I'm going to read straight from them so you will know exactly why and what we are asking from you. In Zoom, you will see a Q&A option at the bottom next to the chat option. Please use the Q&A to submit any questions you have for the panelists to ensure we see your questions. Please use the chat to engage throughout the presentation. We ask that you stay on topic in the chat. In order to chat with each other, please use the blue drop down in your chat box and switch it to everyone. And just keep in mind that we want everybody to be courteous and be anything from neutral to positive when we communicate with one another. Please stay tuned to fill out a brief poll at the very end of the webinar. And lastly, a recording of the webinar will be distributed within 3 days to the email you've registered with. If you do not see it in your inbox in 3 days, be sure to check your spam or visit humananimalsupportservices.org/webinars. All right, now let me introduce two people I'm extremely excited to have on this webinar this week, and that is Katie Jarl and Lauren Loney. Tonight's webinar is Paws and Politics, what you need to know about the 2023 animal welfare legislation. We want to hear from our Director of Government Affairs and Policy for Austin Pets Alive and for Human Animal Support Services, and also the Executive Director for the Texas Pets Alive, and Lauren Loney, who is the Haas staff attorney and policy specialist for APA, which is Austin Pets Alive, for Haas, and for Texas Pets Alive. So without further ado, let's get started. And can each of you tell us a little bit about yourselves and how and why you became involved in policy work?
Sure, I'll go first if that's okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, hello, everybody, and happy Thursday afternoon. My name is Katie Jarl, and I am, as Vincent said, the Director of Government Affairs and Policy for the Pets Alive family, Haas, and then the Executive Director for Texas Pets Alive, which is our advocacy and policy arm, focusing on legislative change here in the state of Texas. I reside in San Antonio, and I am just so thrilled to be able to share some of these legislative session updates with you today. I have been working exclusively in the animal welfare world for going on 15 years now. More than a decade of that has been spent exclusively in the government affairs and policy space. Prior to that, actually 20 years ago, I got my first job working in the Texas legislature as a staffer for a Texas House representative. So I've been lucky enough to, I don't know if I would say lucky, but I've been fortunate enough to be able to be in this policy space now for 2 decades. And it's really just a wonderful opportunity to share some of this stuff with you. And I will just, normally I would not share this because on a professional work call, but I feel like I'm among friends tonight. So I hope you all will forgive me if I'm a little bit foggy. I did just have to very recently say goodbye to my soul dog. So my brain has been a little foggy for the last couple of weeks. And I appreciate all of you joining tonight to hear more about this subject. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Katie, even on your foggiest of brain days, you're still smarter and sharper and more productive and more amazing than so many people. So we're so happy that you're here with us, and we all send you so much love for Bella. So my name is Lauren Loney. I am, like Vincent said, staff attorney and policy specialist for sort of this family of organizations from Austin Pets Alive and Haas. I've been working in animal welfare policy since 2020, so only about 3 years. Prior to that, I worked in policy and in litigation related to affordable housing and environmental justice. I graduated from University of Texas School of Law in 2017 and got into policy specifically after a brief stint in litigation, because I realized that I really wanted to do work that is forward-looking as opposed to retroactive. When you are a litigator, you are being responsive to a harm that has already existed. And sometimes those lawsuits can take, 20 years. And I decided pretty early on in my career that policy as a proactive, forward-looking change is really where I wanted to focus my time. And as we're going to talk about a little bit today, there's so much value in this group of people in animal shelters engaging in forward-looking policy work. And so we're really excited to share that with you today. And, I think anybody can get into policy work. You don't have to go to law school to do it. But I know that for myself, and I think I can speak for Katie as well, we are always more than happy to chat about sort of our pathways into this work, because they're very different pathways. And I think we're really fortunate to be in a space that really values lots of different experiences to bring to the table to create effective policy.
Thank you both very much. So let's get into our first question, which is, how big of a role do you think animal-related bills play in state legislative sessions? And the second part of that question is, are there a lot of animal bills, or is it a relatively small issue?
Yeah, I'll respond to that. So, one of the things that we see all the time, especially across the entire country, is how much this issue is growing in popularity. Just this legislative session, through our consultant animal policy group, we tracked nearly 1,000 bills related to animal welfare across the country during the 2023 legislative session. And to put that in comparison for some of you, there were 1,700 bills introduced across the country on issues of gun control, about 1,100 bills filed on issues of infectious disease and public health, and about 1,300 bills introduced on issues surrounding climate change and the environment. So when you look at it up against some of the most profound issues of our time, animal welfare issue bills are right up there in volume. This is no longer a niche issue. And in fact, when you talk to a lot of state legislators, they will tell you animal welfare bills are some of the toughest bills to work on. They come with a lot of emotion, and they come with a lot of controversy oftentimes. And so we are seeing a real increase state to state in the amount of animal welfare bills that are filed each session.
Thank you. And so to follow up with that, or to add on to that, can you give us an overview of how we've engaged in policy this year?
Yeah, I would love to. I'm definitely going to let Lauren answer that question in more detail. But before she does, I just have to give her the biggest kudos for the work that she is about to outline for you all. When we last year, when I joined the Pets Alive family, I was basically a one-man band, and when we looked last year at the scope of work that we wanted to achieve through human animal support services in 2023, we knew we needed someone that was not only incredibly smart and good at their job, but somebody who had a deep passion for these issues that impact human and animals in the pet space. And so when we started looking for this position, I knew immediately that Lauren was going to be the ideal person for this job. And per usual, she just really exceeded all of our expectations. And we see this role, and the space that Haas plays in animal policy growing for each legislative session, so that we can continue to contribute more and look at more and unique ways for us to engage on issues that may to some people look like human issues, but we know have a trickle-down impact on the way that our pets live with us and exist in our communities. So with that, I will let Lauren take it away for some of the work we did this specifically.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so, you know, Haas has a really interesting role to play with legislation, because there are a lot of players, large and small, in animal welfare related policy, and every organization brings such, you know, sometimes a unique specialty area that they're focusing on. So many different policy advocates and are all coming together. And I feel like one of the most amazing things about being on the Haas team is the opportunity that I had this session this year to support so many pieces of legislation that so many other organizations were working on, and to really lend this this voice, highlighting the intersectional ways that human issues and animal issues overlap, and really being grounded in advocating and supporting policies that are all about keeping pets and people together, and that are really grounded in making sure that we're not just taking care of pets, we're taking care of the people that are with those pets. So because we are, like Katie said, a relatively small shop here over at Haas on the policy team, we really focus our engagement this year on supporting legislation that was introduced in the states where we have pilot shelters. And in particular, we wanted to support our pilot shelters that have government relations staff. We have a few pilot shelters with either staff who do this work on top of all of the other work that they have to do as shelter staff, or we have a few shelters that have specific staff positions for government relations, which we won't go too much into today, but we are huge proponents of budgeting, you know, as you're forward looking again, trying to budget for some sort of government relations staff time. So we provided share graphics, fact sheets, and talking points about various topics that we were the most focused on. I testified during committee meetings and submitted written testimony and letters of support. We conducted direct outreach to legislative offices and had the real pleasure of participating in several coalitions. So specifically this year, we tracked out of that 1,000-ish bills that we tracked broadly, we really narrowed down to just over 40 bills and one rulemaking across 19 states. Attended a little bit more than 45 committee hearings, most of them virtually, but some in person, especially in Texas. We wrote or signed on to 12 letters of support or pieces of testimony in support of various bills, including one sort of new-ish idea, or new to me idea, about writing a letter of support for a bundle of tenants' rights bills in Texas that were all going to the same committee. We wrote one letter of opposition to a piece of bad housing related legislation, and then directly testified in support of 3 bills in Texas, Colorado, and Oregon. I have been part of the Pets and Housing Coalition in previous roles, and was very excited to join that coalition again as a Haas attorney. There's just really incredible folks who are doing the work on the pets and housing issues across the country. And then, of course, we coordinated and shared fact sheets and talking points and lots of research with our pilot shelter directors and their staff. One of the cool things about doing policy work alongside a coalition of animal shelters is that we have a lot of data related to animal sheltering that we can use and really tap into to provide direct support for those policies. So that's just kind of a quick overview of what we did. Again, it was our first time really deeply engaging at the national level, and so we tried our best to be supportive of those organizations who were already working on great bills, and then also making sure that our pilot shelters felt supported as well.
Let me check and see if we have any questions that are appropriate to ask right now. I guess I'll ask this one. Can we propose that shelters without a vet administer rabies vaccination? That's from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, we will get into some more access to care discussion later, but that is a piece of legislation that has been proposed in multiple states. And it is one of the many topics around veterinary care and access to veterinary care that we saw this session. So the short answer is yes, that is something that we are seeing come up more and more as the lack of veterinarians across the country is increasingly impacting shelter staff's ability to vaccinate, spay, neuter, and get their animals adopted. So for sure.
Sweet. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So what types of animal related legislations did you see in 2023?
A lot of different types of legislation. So I'm going to share just a couple of lists here, but I'm not going to read the lists for you all. But these our bill tracking covers all types of animal related legislation, not just bills that are related to the human animal bond. So we saw things ranging from hunting contests, which are these wildlife hunting contests where there's completely unregulated and mass killing of certain species of animals. We saw bills related to livestock animals, the makeup of state agriculture and veterinary boards, lots of appropriations related legislation, bills prohibiting BSL, tax related bills, animals used in research. Saw what I think is a pretty sizable uptick in bills related to pet inclusivity and emergency planning, as more and more places across the country are seeing these extreme weather events. It's not just a hurricane every 10 years or one fire every 10 years. These events are becoming increasingly common and increasingly intense. And so we're starting to see some more focus on how to make sure that those shelters and county plans are inclusive of pets. We saw more, this is a type of legislation we've seen over the years, Good Samaritan bills. So that's where, what can citizens do if pets are locked in hot cars? A broad variety of issues related to pets and situations of domestic violence. An interesting kind of large number of bills related to pet burial and pet cemeteries. I personally haven't worked on that issue, but I thought it was fascinating that there was a handful of bills across the country related to that topic. Lots, of course, still lots of bills focused on animal cruelty, ownership bans if somebody has been accused or charged with animal cruelty, abuse registries, and then some of the more typical sheltering, outdoor sheltering and tethering standards. And then, of course, one of the biggest ones this session was access to veterinary care, which we will go over here in a little bit. And then the last kind of group of bills that we saw a lot of were topics that are more directly related to animal control and animal sheltering. So that rabies vaccination question, I think, is directly related to our sheltering world. Lots of bills related to community cats and TNR, spay neuter, whether that's spay neuter funds, mandatory spay neuter, a fair number of bills related to vicious animals and dangerous dogs. And interestingly, a number of bills related to reporting requirements. So what do shelters have to report to the state? That's a pretty controversial topic and impacts different sized and different resourced shelters very differently. And then a number of bills related to holding times, whether or not shelters have to give public notice lists prior to euthanasia, and then a few bills related to the definition of owner. So I know this is one of the most interesting things about this work is that, you can say you work in animal welfare, you work in animal welfare policy, but the topics that you work on are so wide ranging that you're really engaging in significantly different areas of the law. And that's one of the things I've always loved about this work, is that I always feel like I'm learning, and I'm always being exposed to new areas of the law. So I get to nerd out a little bit every session, depending on what's on the table.
All right. So were there any new or new to you topics that y'all found most interesting?
Yeah, Katie, you want me to start on this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to take up all the time. So there were a couple. I mean, of course, with my background in housing, I loved seeing the really significant uptick in housing related policies that came out of sessions this year. And some sessions are still ongoing. Most of our state legislative sessions have wrapped up for the year, but there's still 4 or 5 states that are still active and have some bills moving. So we're going to dive into the pets and housing issue a little bit deeper later on, so I won't dwell on that too much here. But I thought that some of the issues around taxes, there were a lot of bills related to tax exempting pet food, pet related prescriptions, and other medical supplies, exempting those items from sales and use taxes. So I thought that was a really interesting way, particularly as we're in a time of, serious inflation, and so many people across the country are living paycheck to paycheck. Eliminating that sales and use tax, I think, is kind of an interesting angle. I don't believe any of those bills passed this year. Another element of the tax issue is allowing people to write off expenses related to pet ownership on their own income tax returns. So there were several bills related to writing off veterinary bills on your income tax return. And so I think that those are, again, interesting pathways to get at some of the economic struggles with pet owning. I think that there are some implementation issues possibly to think about with some of those, particularly if you're using expenses as write-offs. So in practice, what does that look like? I'm not super sure. It can be, you have to have a lot of expenses to make to get out of a standard deduction, for example, whenever you are filing your taxes. And there are some issues with people who are lower income and maybe aren't as familiar with some of the ways to write off expenses, of being able to fully understand and have access to that. But I still think it's a really interesting and a unique perspective for how to address some of the cost issues. And then the other group of bills that I thought were particularly interesting, there were probably half a dozen bills related to establishing new boards or new entities to essentially assess the effectiveness of animal cruelty laws in a given state. And I think that's really fascinating, because our movement has been really focused on animal cruelty charges and punishment and enforcement as the primary mechanism for improving animal welfare from a policy perspective. And so these bills, where these new boards and new commissions are established to assess the effectiveness, I think are a really interesting opportunity to have some high-level pointed conversations about how much time, energy, resources do we want to keep putting into these sorts of punishment-based laws.
All right. Okay. And so moving right along, what were the topics that you all engaged in the most this year?
Sure, I can start off by talking a little bit about the access to veterinary care, since that's already come up in at least one question. You know, the access to veterinary care issue was really, vast this session. There were 80 bills filed across 25 states that related to access to veterinary care. There's an asterisk there because there were far more bills related to veterinary care filed across the country. We just narrowed it down to the ones that we felt were really specific to the human-animal bond of accessing veterinary care and increasing access to veterinary care. I know that here in Texas, it is an issue that we are really struggling with in terms of the number of veterinarians versus the number of people that are in need of veterinary service, especially affordable veterinary care. And, we have looked at this issue in several different ways. And as you will see, the legislation that impacts access to veterinary care was very broad this session. There were quite a few bills related to veterinary staff. So for instance, there were quite a few bills filed across the country that increased the responsibilities that would be allowed to be performed by a veterinary technician specialist. It created this new tier of veterinary specialists that would have the ability to basically establish their own veterinary client-patient relationship, so that there were more veterinary staff available to treat people that needed it. A bill along those lines passed in the state of Arkansas, which was really cool. There was also a bill similar to that in Arizona that established their ability to have electronic veterinary client-patient relationships. There were quite a few bills about reciprocity, so basically allowing veterinarians that are licensed in other states to have a quick pathway to come and help and perform veterinary services in another state outside of the one that they are currently licensed in the case of an emergency, certainly when there are more veterinarians that are needed. Quite a few bills that directly target the state government's ability to pay off student loans for people entering the field of veterinary medicine, to encourage more people to do that. As we're sort of thinking along those lines, there was a recent study that came out saying that, 1 out of 4 families struggle with being able to access veterinary care. And then another study that basically came out showing that 40% of low-income owners that did have to surrender their pets said that access to affordable veterinary care would have allowed them to keep that pet in their home. And so this is an issue that impacts not only the human-animal bond, but has a trickle-down effect to the animals that are actually entering your shelters, because their owners simply do not have access to that kind of care. We surveyed 2 of our pilot shelters, one in an urban area, showing that about almost 20% of their owner surrenders over a period of a year or so were related to financial restrictions and access to veterinary care. 20% of their overall owner surrenders. It was even more significant in a rural shelter. 40% of owner surrenders were related to financial hardships and access to veterinary care. So targeting this issue, we know not only impacts the people that really want to keep their pets with them, but also the shelters that are seeing an influx of owner surrenders because of these financial hardships related to veterinary care. Specifically here in Texas this session, it is prohibited in state statute in Texas for animal shelter veterinarians to treat pets that are not that do not have owners that are indigent. That is a very, very low, incredibly low threshold. And as you can imagine, excludes the large majority of the population that really needs to access these services. We did introduce Texas Pets Alive. We worked to introduce a bill this session that would have expanded the number of people that could access care from their shelter veterinarians in the state. And unfortunately, our main opposition in the state of Texas was our state VMA. And so that bill ultimately did not make it through the entire process because of that opposition. And so we share all of this with you and want to paint this picture because we know many of you have veterinarians on staff, or you have a really good relationship with your private practice veterinarian. And these are places where those relationships can make a really big difference. I mean, when you are engaging the veterinarians in your life on this subject and explaining what the data is showing us and how that's impacting the shelters and pets in our communities, having their advocacy at the legislative level is really critical. And so we anticipate that with the shortage of veterinarians, we are only going to see the number of bills surrounding the issue of access to veterinary care increase. I would guess that next session, we will see even more bills along these lines. And so if you ever have any questions, you want some research, you want some follow-up, we've done a lot of that and are always happy to share with you what we've been able to find so that you can take it to your own state legislature.
All right.
And, just to, follow up. So in my experience this session, sitting in and listening in on, maybe 10 or 11 hearings related to access to veterinary care, whether it was the Arkansas bill around veterinary technician specialists or telehealth, telemedicine bills, student loan repayment bills. And, in some states, every state is different about who can be there to testify in person, who has to submit written testimony. The rules of engagement are a little bit different in each state. But one thing that I think this group is really, really well positioned to do is to bring, like Katie was saying, bring that shelter perspective to your public testimony, like to those public opportunities to testify publicly, because there were only a couple of situations, a couple of times where I saw a shelter representative, a shelter voice, explicitly arguing for why these bills are important for the shelter community, the animal sheltering community, in those specific settings. I know so many folks do advocacy behind the scenes, and just because you're not engaging at a committee hearing doesn't mean you're not engaging, but there's something really powerful about making sure that it's not just the private practice group and it's not just animal ag. So those are the two main players that I was seeing in these committee hearings, or private practice veterinarians and veterinarians who treated livestock animals. And the shelter voice was often not present. And so I think this was a really great opportunity to see where there are some really important spaces for this group, for us, for those of us who are working in the animal sheltering world, to be taking up some additional space in these hearings. And like Katie said, we are at Haas is so happy and super happy to help facilitate that for anybody who wants to get more involved.
All right. So tell us, what do you see? Do you have any ideas about what you think will be trending in terms of bills in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a great segue into, one of the other issues that we're really passionate about here at Haas, which is the various issues around pets and housing. And so I do think that category, that topic is going to continue to be a really hot topic in 2024, in part because there was such significant movement in this space this year. So, we tracked approximately 50 bills across 20 states related to pets and housing, and pets and housing is kind of a broad topic. So there are some bills that were directly related to pet policies, breed restrictions, size restrictions. Are pets allowed at all? There were some bills that were related to homeowners insurance and property related insurances and breeds and BSL. So do these homeowners insurance companies or the insurance companies that insure apartment complexes, are they explicitly discriminating against certain breeds of dogs? There were also several bills related to eviction and helping to prevent abandonment for animals whenever they were evicted, whenever a person is experiencing an eviction. And then a few bills that I would describe as bad bills. There's a lot of bad tenants' rights legislation that comes down the pipeline across the country every year. So those are not included in this category necessarily. But the bad bills that we sort of tracked and opposed, the few that I'm noting here were general tenants' rights bills that we thought would have a really significant impact on pet owners in particular. One of them that really comes to mind, and this is the bill that we submitted a letter of opposition to, is in Oklahoma. There was a bill that would have allowed a landlord to, if damages from a tenant exceeded the pet or the security deposit, the landlord could take that tenant to court to recover the remainder, which is already legal, but then they could get 3 times the amount of damages as like this additional penalty for a tenant that happened to cause damages in a unit that was beyond the security deposit. Just these a few really significantly bad tenants' rights bills. But there are still a few bills that are alive in California and in Massachusetts. Oh, and the other big category in this space are bills related to pets and people who are unhoused. So bills that make sure, or that would provide grant opportunities for human shelters to become pet friendly, and bills that would make sure that pets are considered in that emergency planning as well. So a couple of bills that I was really excited to support this session. Huge shout out to the ASPCA and all the work they did in Colorado on House Bill 1068. It was 100% my pleasure to get to support the folks on the ground here in Colorado on a bill that is, to the best of my knowledge at least, the first bill that actively regulates and controls pet deposits and pet rents in market rate housing across the state. It's a really huge deal. Pet rents and pet deposits have become this truly exorbitant way that landlords are making money off of pet owners. And I'm not talking about a security deposit or a deposit that's refundable. So, it's one thing to have a pet security deposit of a few $100s that's refundable. It's another thing to have a non-refundable pet fee up front that is, this $1,000. And we see that across the country, these really high non-refundable pet fees, really high monthly pet rents that are truly barriers to entry for so many tenants with pets. And probably most of the folks on this call know that housing issues and cost of veterinary care are widely cited as the top 2 reasons for pet relinquishment in the country. So House Bill 1068, not only did it cap pet deposits at $300, those deposits have to be refundable. They cannot be non-refundable fees. It also capped monthly pet rent at $35 $5 or 1.5% of monthly rent, whichever is higher. So that was such a lift, and I was just really excited to be a part of the group working on that bill, and that goes into effect in January. We also saw some really great bills pass around the eviction related issue. So at least 2 bills, House Bill 1068 in Colorado and a bill in Maryland, made sure that if a person is being evicted and they have a pet, the law enforcement officer that comes to process that eviction on site has to notify an animal services organization of the presence of the pet. The law enforcement officer has to have the ability to inspect the property for a pet. The tenant has to be notified of where their pet went. And the landlord cannot simply tie the animal up to a street sign outside and leave it there. They can't just let an animal loose. So really put in some good protections in place for pets in the unfortunately not uncommon situation where people and their pets are being evicted from their homes. And then one really cool thing about the Maryland bill is a requirement that the state has to distribute a list of resources for pets and tenants who are experiencing evictions, and the landlords have to provide that to pet owning tenants. One of the things that we see across all, not just in animal welfare, but across all subject areas where you are providing services, especially legal services for lower income people, is just a lack of resources and a lack of understanding what your rights are, right? So this sort of know your rights provision, an explicit list of resources are both really, really helpful ways to make sure that people have the resources, or at least know about the resources that are available in their area. So all that to say, looking forward to 2024, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen really fast. I think that we are probably going to see, like I said, a continued focus on pets and housing. That's, I think, a lot of organizations, a lot of people have really recognized that connection. And so that's really exciting. I think that we're going to see an uptick in some interesting types of issues that are actually not really super related to HOS. Issues related to, a number of states had growing numbers of bills related to licensing of dog trainers, regulating groomers, regulating boarding facilities. Those are in responses to pretty high profile deaths and fires and losses of pets at grooming and boarding facilities. I think that we also will hopefully continue to see a shift in our legal and policy related resources away from this massive number of bills that are related to increasing penalties for animal cruelty, broadening the scope of animal cruelty, really making these punishment, mandatory, enforcement-based laws the focus, and really a shift, hopefully, towards more of these provision of resources bills. We're already starting to see that with bills related to pets and eviction, bills related to pets and people who are unhoused, and we need to see a continued shift in that direction. And I hope that we will continue seeing that in next session as well. And that's something that I think we're at HOS really interested in continuing to engage on. So if there's anybody on this call who is really interested in how do we, because right now our programmatic work has really become about provision of resources, right? So many shelters, so many organizations have really bought into and are hyper focused on access to care and access to resources. And our policy work, I think, is lagging a little bit in that space. So my hope is to see our policy work follow in the footsteps of the programmatic work that we've already seen be really successful in lots of communities across the country.
All right. So I know it can be challenging to keep track of all of this information and understand the best ways to engage. Are there any tools that folks can call on or to utilize to better engage in the legislative process?
Yes, thank you for asking, Vincent. We're so proud of this tracking resource that we have created. And I will tell you, in all of my years working in the animal welfare space and the policy space, one of the things that was the hardest to get was a full picture of what is going on across the country related to these types of pieces of legislation. And so at Haas, we tried to make that as simple as possible. We understand that not every single shelter and every single municipality has access to a tracking chart the way that you would like to. And so we have tried to demystify that a little bit. We put together a government communications toolkit that you can download on the Haas website that has a lot of just helpful tools on what you can do to engage with your legislators at the local and state level, sort of a 101 on interacting with your elected officials. In that toolkit, you will have access for free to our map. Lauren showed earlier on one of her slides a map, and that map is interactive and it is available to all of you for free as a resource. You can click on any state in that map, and a list of all of the animal welfare related bills that we tracked this session, and some of them still ongoing, will appear in that map, so you can get a live look. So if something we talked about on this webinar tonight and you think to yourself like, oh, I would love to see that bill in my state, or I wasn't aware of that bill and it was in my state, please go to our government communications toolkit, look at the map, click your state or any relevant state, and you will get access to not only a list of those pieces of legislation, but also a direct link to be able to view the text of that bill and see where that bill ended up, if it passed, if it was signed into law, or if it didn't make it this session.
Right. So it looks like we're going to get to some audience questions, and they are juicy, people. Let's start. Let me see if I can. Let's start with, do you have any thoughts on the New York Animal Protection Federation passing the Companion Animal Care Standards Act?
I'm not completely, I'll be honest when I say I am not very familiar with that specific piece of legislation. Are you, Lauren?
No, we didn't really engage in New York very much this session. But I'm happy to follow up, and I'm more than happy to take a look at that piece of legislation and provide feedback. I'll just stick with that because I have not engaged.
Is there any bills focusing on supporting owners post-natural disaster?
That's a great question. So I don't know exactly how to answer that question as it relates to like post-natural disaster. I do know that there were a number of bills related to including pets in planning at the government level in case of natural disaster. So I'm assuming that post-natural disaster is part of that conversation. So an example is if you have a hurricane, and that's just what because being from Texas, that's, the big ones that we have dealt with. So if there's a hurricane, every county has an emergency management plan that they are responsible for enacting. They're responsible for opening up the shelters where people come and stay temporarily. So there are bills to make sure that that planning is inclusive of pets. So I think that that's probably the best I can answer that question.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is, we've talked 100% really on this call about state legislative advocacy, but we could talk just as long about advocacy at your local, municipal, or county level. And as Lauren said, usually emergency management and response is handled at the local level. And so oftentimes If you see an opportunity where your local government or your county government could do more to support people and pets following a natural disaster, you've seen an example of this being done well somewhere else, or you have some ideas, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to your local government elected officials and set up a meeting to talk to them about some of those ideas.
All right, another question from an old friend of mine, Penny Ellison. Hello, Penny. What are the bills that you are finding that have the most bipartisan support?
Interesting question.
That is an interesting question.
Yeah.
You wanna-
I feel like my understanding is so specific and focused towards Texas. So you may have a better understanding of some of the national play, Lauren.
Yeah, I think that in general, a lot of it just really depends on the topic. But in general, amongst companion animal bills, there is a lot of bipartisan support in many topics. Now, state to state, you see differences. So, we have been seeing not bipartisan support in every case for access to veterinary care work. We see not bipartisan support, fully bipartisan support in some of the housing related bills. But I think that companion animal issues in general are more bipartisan than other animal issues, such as issues related to livestock or issues related to wildlife, which tend to be more partisan in nature. I think that, in the housing space, I think that, which is what I'm most familiar with, I think that there is a fair amount of bipartisan support, but it's not quite the same as typical, sheltering related, like cruelty related companion animal bills. Oh, Kelsey made a good comment in the chat that their Florida BSL bill was super bipartisan. Thank you, Kelsey, for reminding us of that.
All right. How can we move away from this question is from Megan Kent. How can we move away from punishment/enforcement focused policy when lots of animal welfare organization supporters see increased penalties, etc.?
Well, there's a loaded question to end the night with. I think that this is really, again, to me, it points back to a lot of the work that so many people in this space are already doing programmatically, right? We're already so focused on only using enforcement in some of the most extreme ways and really being much more heavily focused on how do we make sure people have access to the things that they need. It's a work in progress. It's not perfect, but there's so much energy going in that space. If you have a dog that is continuing to get out of their fence programmatically, what's going to happen on the ground is an ACO is going to either refer somebody to resources where they can get a fence repair, or in a lot of cases, they're going to go out and do that fence repair themselves and make sure that that person has what they need to keep their pet from violating that ordinance. It's a really, to me, then logical shift to take what we're learning programmatically and put that into our policy space. I think that we are, we've seen a big, it's really controversial amongst animal welfare organizations, right? We saw this with some of the tethering work, right? Where there has been a shift away from punishing people who have their dogs tied up outside, with the building growing recognition that so much of that is grounded in issues related to poverty. So I think that the big thing is just to challenge when you hear people saying, oh, we need to punish people more for not doing X, Y, and Z. I think the biggest thing is to challenge that notion from within our culture as animal welfare first, with all the data and all the information we have in our tool belt now to show that those positive programmatic provisions of resources are so much more effective.
Yep. And I know we are limited on time, so I will just add one tiny thing, and Lauren just touched on it a little bit, is that, you know, I think historically, animal welfare hasn't been really strong in data. We haven't, you know, done a great job of tracking some of the predominant reasons and categorizing them to why animals are ending up in shelters in the first place. But from the data that we do have, from the data that we are using, we are able to be more surgical about why these animals are entering the system. And we know that the majority of time, people aren't coming to the shelter saying, I hate dogs and I don't want this one. They're saying, I'm struggling in some way to adequately provide for this animal, and I am lacking a resource that is necessary for me to be able to keep it. And so in that way, I think we can look at the data and be really targeted about the ways that impact the most pets and their people.
One more thing, I know we're short on time, but one more thing I just was thinking about too is that I think historically our movement has really done a great job. Like I say that, I mean, we've been successful in fundraising off of cruelty, right? We have fundraised off of, we're rescuing these animals from these terrible situations. And I think that there's been a shift in recent years to a recognition that that's not the only way for an animal welfare group to be successful and to be able to fundraise and to be able to make a difference. And so I think that shift is already happening all over the country and in organizations of all sizes. It's really just a matter of taking all of that and translating it into policy, which is not always easy, but that is something that Haas is working on. I saw a question in the chat about ordinance level. How do we get more positive versus punitive ordinances? That's a project that at Haas we're actively working on. We're making recommendations at the local level about how to get rid of punitive measures and replace them with more positive ordinance language.
Sweet. Thank you so much. This is a terrific webinar tonight. Thank you, Katie and Lauren. You know how much I respect both of you, your intelligence and the amount of work that it takes to get this legislative work done, and working on behalf of Haas. I couldn't be more proud to be associated with you all. So just a few housekeeping things. In a moment, you'll see a brief poll about the webinar pop up. Please take a minute to complete that poll and let us know what your thoughts are about tonight's event before you go. If we didn't get to your question, which I think we got to everybody's, but if we happen to not, you can email us at haas-project@americanpetsalive.org. And as a reminder, tonight's webinar recording will be distributed within 3 business days. All right, so
Vincent?
Yes.
Sorry,
yes.
I don't mean to interrupt you, just super quickly. I hope that our email addresses were shared somewhere in the chat at some point. Lauren and I are eager to hear from you. We are happy to talk with you about any questions you have. If you want to deep dive into these things, please feel free to reach out to us. So, you know, it's pretty easy to find both of us. It's Katie.Jarl at Austin Pets Alive and Lauren.Loney at Austin Pets Alive. You know, please, yes, thank you so much. And the only other thing I'm going to say is I did see something pop up in the chat about there being a password to access the bill tracker that we have on the Haas website. The password is located in the government communications toolkit. So if you open the toolkit and you click on the map, there's a password right there. It'll get you right in.
Thank you very much, Katie. And that was very important. I'm glad you made our audience aware of that. So for more details, we on our next webinar, that'll be released soon. Please keep an eye out on your email. And thank you for being here tonight. We're always thinking about you. You're always on our mind. And we look forward to all of the great work you're doing. So keep going out there and being heroes for people and for animals. Have a good night.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.